Good afternoon and welcome back to Never Is Now, ADL's signature panel on anti-Semitism and hate. My name is Tama Smith and I'm pleased to be the moderator for this panel conversation, Confronting Anti-Black Racism to Fight Anti-Semitism. The fights against anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism are so closely linked, both in terms of working towards a more just society for all of its members, and because of the growing diversity of the Jewish community itself, which means that more and more Jewish families are directly impacted by anti-Black racism as well as anti-Semitism. The topic of our conversation today is not just of professional interest to me, it's personal as the daughter of a Black American. Anti-Black racism is an issue not just in society at large, but also in our Jewish community, in our synagogues, schools, and community organizations. Without addressing the impacts of racism on Black Jews, we really and truly cannot move forward in our communal fight against hate. Our panelists today will discuss their work and what each of us can do in doing just this, tackling anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism as part of the struggle to dismantle hate across our society. I'd like to take a moment just to introduce you to each of them. We have with us today Yolanda Savage-Narva, who is the Director of Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for the Union of Reform Judaism. She comes to this role with 20 years' experience working with public agencies and nonprofit organizations to promote equity and inclusion, including most recently working as the Executive Director of Operation Understanding DC, a nonprofit dedicated to promoting understanding, cooperation, and respect while fighting to eradicate racism, anti-Semitism, and all forms of discrimination. Among many of her other community roles, she sits on the board of directors of the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington and the Capitol Jewish Museum. Chava Shervington is an attorney, advocate, and mother. She's a recognized voice on issues of racial equity and inclusion in the Jewish community, and the founder of Kamocha, an organization that supports and gives voice to Black Orthodox Jews. She's also a board member of the Jewish Multiracial Network. She has long recognized a need for increased support of Jews of color and has called for building new communal mechanisms and practices to educate and generally serve the entire Jewish community in a more representative and inclusive way. Eric Ward is the Executive Director of the Western State Center and a Senior Fellow at the Southern Poverty Law Center. He's a nationally recognized expert on the relationship between authoritarian movements, hate violence, and preserving inclusive democracy. He took the helm of the Western State Center in 2017, and since then, it has become a national hub for innovative responses to white nationalism, anti-Semitism, and structural inequality dedicated to working towards a world where everyone can live, love, work, and worship free from bigotry and fear. There is so much more to know about each of these panelists, but I want to make sure to leave as much time as possible for what promises to be a packed session. If you'd like to learn more about their work, you can read their full bios as well as mine on the speakers page at neverisnow.org. We'd love to answer a few of your questions towards the end of this session, so please don't forget to ask them by clicking the Q&A button to the right of the video. Please submit questions throughout the panel, and we'll select as many as we can to ask the panelists before we run out of time this afternoon. I'm going to start with you, Eric. Eric, you've written extensively about how anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism are linked. Can you provide a bit of a 10,000-foot view for people tuning into this panel today?
Absolutely, and Tim, it's wonderful to see you and hear your voice, and Hava and Yolanda as well. You're not just voices, Black voices within the Jewish community, but you're Black voices within the Black community as well, and I'm grateful to be sitting with you all today. Look, as a non-Jewish person, I learned very early on in the midst of hate crimes that were happening in the Pacific Northwest that anti-Semitism seemed to be at the core of this. I grew up in a time where the white nationalist movement was engaged in armored robberies, murders, such as the murder of a Jewish radio talk show host by the name of Alan Berg, a radio talk show host in Denver, Colorado, the murder of a Black Ethiopian student by the name of Mulligator Sarah in the streets of Portland, Oregon. As we were helping communities respond to this wave of hate crime and hate happening here in the Pacific Northwest is now what the country is facing. But at the time, it was unique. We began to kind of collect information. We noticed, Tema, some anti-Semitic caricature, right, or a Jewish symbol. It led us to understand that at the end of the day, anti-Semitism wasn't just at the core of the white nationalist movement. It was the core of the white nationalist movement. It was so central to white nationalist ideology that I, as a racial justice activist, quickly understood that we as Black people, and quite frankly, any other marginalized groups, would never win equity in the society if we were not also active in the struggle to maintain and manage this white nationalist threat. And that meant confronting anti-Semitism. I'll explain that amongst 21st century white nationalists, Jews are cast in the same role that they have always filled for anti-Semites, right? As the absolute others, demons stirring the pot of lesser evils and the driving force behind white dispossession, right? At the foundation of that modern day movement, right, that has caused so much damage in our country, right? The 140 law enforcement officers injured at the Capitol on January 6th, right? It has white nationalists have been involved in a significant amount of physical violence and murders in this country. But there was this claim, right, that Jews were, and indeed because of the fact they were seen as white, were an enemy race that needed to be exposed and eliminated. But there's a connection here to anti-Black racism that we shouldn't forget. We have to understand that this white nationalist movement comes from a backlash, right? It's a backlash to the victory of the 1960s civil rights movement. There are three corner pieces of legislation that made up the pillar of the civil rights victory, right? The Civil Rights Act to end segregation, the Voting Rights Act to protect the vote, and the third we often don't talk about is an Immigration Reform Act. And the Immigration Reform Act sought to undo the racist policies that led to Jews being prevented from fleeing Europe in the midst of the pogroms, right, and the Holocaust. And it's funny now that it is these three policies that are under attack. But for white nationalists, they were never going to admit, right, those who believed in separate but equal in Jim Crow, they were never going to admit that they lost to Black people. They saw Black people as inferior. And so instead, they crafted something they borrowed from the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. And they recast a story that they didn't lose to Black people, right? For them, the fantasy of invisible Jewish power explained how Black Americans, a race of supposed could orchestrate the end of Jim Crow, or how in the LGBT community could additional gender roles, or even how immigrants could mount a challenge to economic inequality in this country. The truth is this, is that the power of anti-Semitism is that it denies the agency of marginalized communities in this country. It says that we have no legitimate grievances, that we're merely puppets, right, of Jewish puppet masters. It is those tropes of anti-Semitism that are deeply dangerous, not just to the Jewish community, but to Black communities and other marginalized communities. Tim, I'll end this way because I've gone on long enough. But one of the things we have to understand, right, is that anti-Semitism is not merely just a set of behaviors, right? It's an ideology that explains the world for a number of people and social movements. It doesn't just exist on the right, right? There is no left or right anti-Semitism. There is merely anti-Semitism in our society, and we have political movements that tap into that anti-Semitism in order to build power. And on the right, that building of power has been to undo 75 years of civil rights struggle led by largely Black Americans and others. At the end of the day, anti-Semitism, as Tima has said, is anti-Black. And without addressing anti-Semitism, a form of racism, we will never successfully unend racism in American society. And that's what most of us want to do, regardless of our color or religion. We really want a world that, in a society that is grounded in opportunity, equity, not segregation, not racial violence. And this is why we center anti-Semitism.
Sorry, my dog was barking in the background, so I muted myself. It's still,
That's
the
okay.
COVID
I was
work
going
from
to take the
home.
exam. Tim, I was
Yeah,
just going to wax on. I was like, oh, open space, but I'm not. I'm just
open
teasing.
space. Yeah, I mean, look, what I was trying to say that nobody heard was, Eric, I could listen to you talk about this all day. So, thank you so much for kicking us off with
You're
such a
welcome.
really, I think, important understanding of how these issues are so deeply intertwined and in some ways are one and the same issue for us to be tackling as a society and as people who believe in justice. Yolanda, I'd love to hear a little bit from you about in your work and how you see these dynamics playing out in your work for racial justice.
Of course. First, I want to say thank you, Tema, Hava, and Eric for being here. Thanks to the ADL for creating this amazing platform for us to have this discussion of how we can combat anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, and hate together. Um, I think that's a really great question. And Eric, thank you so much for your framing because I've been thinking a lot about this. And I've done a little research myself over the years and kind of studied how movements work. And sometimes how movement building tends to put that racial justice, racial equity work over there. And we're focused on, for example, fighting poverty or ending homelessness or focused on eradicating health disparities when the undercurrent is always based on these racial inequities and racial disparities that's a part of this country. And I think historically in movement building, for example, the women's rights movement, it started out focused largely on white women's rights, and I think when we exclude racial, ethnicity, when we exclude focusing on race and anti-Semitism in movements, it really distorts what we're trying to do, and it makes it a divided effort instead of something that should be coming together. And so when we disrupt in that way, it really takes the energy away from tackling the systemic inequities that are part of all forms of hatred in this country. And it also, in my opinion, really exposes kind of this implicit, explicit bias that can be a part of movements when we're not focusing on the impact of racism and how anti-Semitic tropes and Jewish hatred is kind of a part of a narrative that divides people. And so I think that that's something that we really have to focus on when we're trying to build allies and build a consensus around, and addressing hate and addressing oppression in this country, that dividing ourselves in that way is very damaging and counterproductive to what we're trying to do as a movement of disrupting and dismantling the system of white supremacy and white dominant culture in this country.
Absolutely. And the one thing that is coming up for me as you're talking here is how do we define what goes into these different sort of oppressions that we experience and that we're coming together in coalition over? And Kava, I know this is something that you think about a lot. Who gets to be heard when they say something is racist or something has is anti-Semitic? What have your experiences been that have led you to sort of really do that deep thinking on this?
Thank you. And like everyone else, I wanted to thank everyone for being a part of this really important conversation. I think that at the core, right, the things that create conflict, create tension within communities is sincere misunderstanding of another's experience, narrative, and history, right? We can all sincerely be interested in improving conditions for everyone, but speak from our own personal lens, right? And so from that, we center ourselves, our feelings, what we know about intention around and discard or disregard how we've been socialized by society to there's anti-Semitism built into the fabric of the way in which we consider a lot of things. There's anti-Black racism baked into the way we understand the world. So when people say, hey, that's racist or that's anti-Semitic, we're like, no, 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 no. It's not. What it is I'm explaining a fact, or I'm explaining my understanding, and not allowing people to own that narrative. And I think part of us as a Jewish community, when we talk about anti-Semitism, part of a large frustration is before we can even tackle anti-Semitism, we have to be able to own, right, what is anti-Semitism, right? Other communities, when we say, hey, I'm telling you that based on my history, not just on this land, but globally, right, that this narrative, this trope has been utilized for oppression of my people, both, civically, educationally, and also through violent oppression, right? And people say, oh, no, but it's a compliment, right? It's the way in which people talk about moneyed interest, or they reference New York, or other different things that are based and rooted in kind of concepts of anti-Semitism that are harmful. And we understand that when we talk about anti-Semitism, right? We understand how important the controlling of that conversation is. And so when we are thinking about confronting anti-Black racism, we need to kind of approach it with that same frame and with that same lens. What does it mean for us as a community to engage with Black people in this country and allow them to determine, like to self-determine what anti-Black racism is? Who is more integrally involved in understanding their own experience, both on an individual and a communal level, than Black America? It's the same with us. And I think that is part of the root of a lot of communal tension around these topics, and understanding that we are so involved in our own current understanding in society that part of what this is going to take is unlearning and learning, right? The roots of some of these ideas. Where are the basis of some of our assumptions in society? And when I think we can do that, we're going to go a long way to broadening and furthering this conversation.
Absolutely. And this really to me points to some of the ways that sometimes I see and feel people talking past each other when it comes to fighting hate. That, people will want to, people who really do intend to engage in the kind of unlearning you're talking about, Chava, don't seem to be able to see when they're not doing it. Yolanda, you work on the ground in Jewish community every day doing this sort of work. What do you think causes some of that impasse in being able for communities to understand how these pieces are really sort of woven into the fabric of our everyday life?
Right. And I think Hava began to dive into some of those pieces that we don't necessarily understand the roots or the historical trauma that are a part of our communities in a way that we understand how it impacts how we navigate oppression, both individually and collectively. I mean, I think the reality that we face on the ground right now is that everyone is focused on right now what's in front of them, the oppression that they are dealing with right now, and how it impacts them or can potentially impact them down the line. So I think specifically, and this is global as well, but specifically focused on how the United States kind of looks at these things. The Black community in this country, and I'm thinking about the descendants of enslaved Africans, and the Jewish community, multiple ancestry lines, have experienced horrific, unspeakable trauma from slavery, the Holocaust, and multiple other experiences as well. And just for the record, these are not binary communities where we have a Black community and a Jewish community. People are intersectional and hold multiple identities. And with that, hold multiple historical trauma as well. And we have to understand how that impacts how we communicate with one another. And so when we think about historical trauma, there's individual trauma, and then there's this collective trauma that's kind of passed through our genetic code to the descendants of people who were involved in horrific events. This trauma is cumulative and it reverberates across generations. And so, as a result of the trauma, we have something that's called the historical trauma response. And that manifests itself in individuals in more destructive behavior, in a sense, but it also manifests itself collectively in groups of people, which can sometimes make people find themselves unable to hear and understand and connect with other people's oppression. And so that makes it very challenging to have conversations that help people understand that anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism actually orbit one another and that we have to tackle those together. And so in order to be able to do that, addressing that internal response to trauma that kind of makes us pull back and focus on what's happening has to be addressed in order for us to step forward, have the conversations that we need to have so we can make sure we're addressing our trauma and working together so we can understand how these things work together so we can collectively fight them. And I think that's one of the things that gets in the way of having these conversations and collectively working together to eradicate this system that we're living in.
I've called it from time to time, the batten down the hatches effect, right? It's like people feel under attack. And so what do is rather than reach out to adjacent communities for help, it's like, we got to shore up our fortifications here. And I think, as you pointed to, Yolanda, our communities, and Chava also pointed to earlier, like our communities are not mutually exclusive they never were, and especially not now, number one, but also that our fight is so deeply integrated. And Eric, you do lots of work around coalition, and I'm wondering if there's anything that you have to build on what Yolanda was just saying there about how these sort of impasses come to impact the work.
Yeah. The one thing I know is we should be listening to a lot more of Yolanda. I think what she's saying is exactly right. We have to understand coalitions are complicated. Now, imagine we live in a society where most of us are given a racial identity. And we should say something here, right? Because this has gotten forgotten over the last 75 years. And I think it bears repeating, right? Race is not a real construction, right? There's no biological definition of race. It is a social construction, right? That was created, right, to maintain social control, right, within a society. And we should always keep that in mind. But look, none of us gets to decide that. Society has the power to define us, and in this society, it is largely defined by race, right, religion, and gender, and so we find ourselves often pitted against one another in society, right, for a number of reasons. The first is a personal. It is very hard for an individual to understand that they can both be the victim of a form of bigotry and the perpetuator, right, of a bigotry, and sometimes at the same exact time. We have all on this panel, and Timmy, you as well, have watched moments, right, where conflict and tension because of anti-Semitism and racism have sparked between Black and Jewish communities, often putting Jews of color and particularly Black Jews, right, in the middle, right, of those tensions, whether they wanted to be in the middle or not, often bearing the brunt of it. But often those tensions get heightened by folks outside of those communities who have some stake, right, in those tensions, right? And often because of our inability to just be able to say that I can both be a victim of racism and perpetuate anti-Semitism. That doesn't make me an evil person. There are people, right, who consciously are out there promoting anti-Semitism in order to build political power. Louis Farrakhan, David Duke, we could go down the list, right? But most of us, when we perpetuate anti-Black racism, or we perpetuate anti-Semitism, it's unconscious, right? They're just ways we have been socialized. But we have become overly defensive, right? We have lost our courage to really lean in to one another and to understand that we have to keep practicing with one another. Look, I want to be clear, right? There's a personal piece here about trying to be kinder, better people, right? To kind of give an example in a moment of chaos around how we walk through the world, right? In moments of great uncertainty, right? That is a personal call that all of us should be answering in this moment. But there are larger considerations. Look, anti-Semitism has been used in the modern era to weaken and attack democracy after democracy, right? Creating this, using the Jew as this kind of existential other who's, seeking to manipulate finance or culture or whatever, right? And to tell people that we have no agency in society, that the inequality we are facing is not because of greed, but because of some racialized conspiracy of Jews. We have to understand that that is an effective narrative. If it wasn't an effective narrative, right, people wouldn't be using it. One of the things I've learned from organizing in communities, right, working with former white nationalists who have come out, right, is that the white nationalist movement and other anti-Semites don't promote anti-Semitism just to promote anti-Semitism. Right? They have found it to be an effective tool to building power. And we have to become more sophisticated and to understand we have real personal work that needs to happen within the Black and Jewish communities, right? If nothing else, for the sake of Black Jews who have to walk both of those worlds with a lot of unfair pressure being put upon them, right? But the other reason is because it is how we preserve this multiracial democracy, this great American experiment. To preserve this American experiment, we have to preserve democracy. And anti-Semitism is one of the greatest threats to this democracy. I don't have to tell anyone that now. We've seen Charlottesville. Watching Integrity First for America launch this amazing civil suit to hold the white nationalist movement accountable. But they built that, right, off of unconscious and unconscious and conscious anti-Semitism. But look, can we also hold, right, quite honestly, that we have a double standard in terms of how we treat people, right, who intentionally or unintentionally use anti-Semitism? Black people are treated at a level, right, that most white perpetrators of anti-Semitism do not receive, right? And that is not because there's something wrong with the Jewish community. That has to do with just how unconscious racial bias functions in American society. How do we tackle anti-Semitism if we can't be courageous enough to bring forward the nuances and complexities, right, of unpacking forms of prejudice? And I'll just say one thing, and then again, I'm going to be quiet and let others talk. But I want to turn it back to this, right? We have made Jews who are Black, right, the bridge in these conversations, largely without their permission, right, largely without their input, right? And if we are going to do anything about getting serious about anti-Semitism in this moment, let's stop doing that, right? Let's start listening to what they're telling us. Let us understand that if we want them to be the bridges between communities, that we have to figure out how to bolster and support them in this very difficult moment. Anti-Semitism isn't going away, right? Racism isn't going away. But what we all know is you can't fight anti-Semitism without tackling racism. And you can't tackle racism without addressing anti-Semitism. They are intertwined in this nation right now. And we need folks who are sophisticated and courageous and responsible enough to really juggle that in this moment. This country needs it.
Eric, I appreciate you bringing up bringing up people like Farrakhan and also the ways in which Black Jews are sort of treated as a bridge, as well as Black folks being held to a different standard sometimes on anti-Semitism. And just a brief anecdote as we pivot to talking a little bit about some of the sort of work forward that came to my mind as you were talking is all of the times that I, as a white passing mixed race Black Jewish woman, have been asked to speak out against Farrakhan, as if his existence isn't, first of all, deeply damaging to many in the Black community, and that I somehow am responsible for the Nation of Islam because I'm part Black. Like, it's just mind-boggling to me. And you're with me in the trenches on Twitter, and play out. And for me, this is generally coming from my Jewish community, which is very painful to be called a, a sympathizer of Semites because
respond to oppression. And that increases tension somewhat, right? Because you have communities like the Black community in the United States, which faces a lot of unfair policing, police brutality, etc. And then you have a Jewish community which does not engage with police in the same way. So when they're facing violent oppression or attacks, lean into policing. And what does that mean for us to come together as a coalition, right? When we're talking about communities that have access to legislative power, in a way, how do they lean into, I want to legislate against anti-Semitism on campus, right? And how that's heard when certain other communities don't feel like they have the same access to, so they might be marching on the streets. And how does our discomfort with each other's response, like oppression response, impact our ability to be in relationship with each other, right? Does that historical narrative and experience is something that, when Eric was talking about being courageous to kind of see both like the racism or anti-Semitism in our communities, there's also a courage in being able to have a conversation around, right? Safety for me does not equal police, and safety for me does equal police. So how do we as communities come together in relationship and talk about how we can collectively have a conversation around policing, right? That doesn't just end in, like a political spectrum conversation, right? But has like an authentic conversation about the different experiences we as communities have with certain institutions in this country, right? That is a huge part, I think, of the missing communal relations part of how we are having conversations about anti-racism and also anti-Semitism. That there is an acknowledgement, right? That we can be oppressed peoples in the same country and experience that oppression very differently, right? How the type of oppression that I face as a Jewish person in America is different from the type of oppression that I face in America as a Black person. However, the roots of that oppression is the same, right? The people who are furthering that white nationalist, white supremacist ideology, they're gaining the same benefit from oppressing both populations. How do we come together to acknowledge both our different experiences? And different does not necessarily have to be worse or less. I think that unfortunately, some of these conversations become confrontational rather than collaborative, right? Well, if this happened to your community, everyone would speak out. If this happened to your community, there would be X, Y, the police would be out in full support. What does it look like to say, I understand that your oppression manifests differently than mine, but we have to find a way to work together to serve both of our communities' collective safety, whether that be conversations around voting and access to the ballot box, or that be conversations around the real way in which anti-Semitic violence is a threat at a variety of Jewish institutions. What does it look like to come together and have some really courageous conversations around acknowledging the different ways in which oppression manifests for our communities, and how we can be creative partners, right? The solution doesn't have to look like what it's always looked like, right? What it's always looked like isn't working. So let's come together as communities and say, let's think broadly. Let's think about the roots of this, right? Like, who is served by thinking that you're the puppet and you're the puppet master? And how do we get the puppet and the puppet master in conversation, right? To really think about how we dismantle some of the harm in real ways that impact us as a collective, rather than working in a siloed structure, which puts us in conflict with each other.
Right, and it's becoming more and more apparent to me that I mean, we all know that it's hard to hold tension. It's hard to hold contradiction. And I think it's especially hard to hold tension and contradiction when we're talking about not just our values, but also our community's well being. And I think that's something that, as we work in coalition and as we work to sort of secure the safety of people also inside our community who are dealing with some of these contradictions directly, this is going to be really important work going forward. Eric, have you observed people sort of successfully holding these tensions or really unsuccessfully holding these tensions? What challenges does this pose to being in solidarity against the rising tide of hate in the US and beyond?
Yeah. So here's the interesting thing. Yes, I think people have held these tensions extremely well, right? I think we saw it last fall when many Americans came together and drew a very clear moral barrier against bigotry in this country. Look, I came up in coalitions working with rabbis and Republican farmers sitting next to blue hair Mohawk punk rockers. And, we didn't agree. Let's be clear. We did not agree on everything, right? Law enforcement was at that table, right? You name it. They were sitting at that table across the political spectrum, libertarians, conservatives, right? People on the left. And why we didn't agree on everything, we understood, right, that bigotry wasn't the answer to the complex problems that we're facing. And that also organized bigotry, right, was a threat to all of us, and that we needed to try to figure out ways to move forward together. Now, some folks accused us, Tima, of reaching for the lowest common denominators. But I find folks who typically say that are folks who are sitting in an immense amount of privilege, right? To tell us, right, who survive in this country and in this world, what the lowest common denominator is for us. We want to be safe. We want to have the space and the opportunity to be creative about our solutions, not doing it under fear and pressure. So look, I have seen some amazing things, right, within the immigrant rights coalitions, right? We saw it in the midst of Black Lives Matters, right? We have seen communities come together, but there's a lesson here. We shouldn't overplay this, right? We should understand that the 20th century civil rights movement in this country was a Black-led movement that constructed a strong relationship with a portion of the Jewish community. Now, I want to be clear, it was not the whole Jewish community, and it wasn't the whole Black community either. But within each community, there were folks who were very serious, right, about formulating that coalition. And that coalition was amazing because it wasn't an identitaire social movement, right? When we look at the successes of the civil rights movement, no one can say, well, it just benefited Black folks or it just benefited the Jewish community. In fact, right, the civil rights movement in the 1960s has delivered more for white America, right, than white supremacists, white nationalists ever have and ever will. And so here we now sit in the 21st century, and a civil rights movement is desperately needed. And that Black Jewish coalition, right, whatever it looks like in this new period, right, it won't look like the old, right, it is still desperately needed. And I do see it, right, Tim, I see it on social media when folks aren't being nasty, right? I see it in organizing. I see it in policy shops. I see it in courtrooms. There is a segment of the Black community and there's a segment of the Jewish community who understand the importance of this moment and understand we both have internal work to do. And at the same time, we have to address the real threats, right, to democracy that are in front of us. So I tell folks, don't give up hope. But it's hard, right? Anti-Semitism is I'm a person who has been organizing around anti-Semitism since the 90s. I found a paper I wrote with a friend of mine who is now a rabbi in California during the conversation on multicultural curriculum at the University of Oregon in 1991-92. And he and I wrote an essay arguing, right, that that anti-Semitism needed to be part of the core curriculum that was looking at other forms of bigotry. And we were making an argument about that. We were practicing, right? We were practicing for this moment that's coming. And I think, right, Yolanda, you, Tima, Hava, I'm going to keep talking about you all, right? Because I'm old punk rocker, right? I'm probably, I'm on my last stage dives coming up, right? I just want to say, there are folks out there looking with all seriousness to construct and hold together that 21st century coalition. And you three are the voices of that 21st century civil rights movement. The rest of us just have to figure out that if you all are going to be bridges, we can't walk across your backs, right? That's not fair. That's a lot to ask of people. So yes, it's there. The question is, when do we recognize that those leaders are already practicing, and how do we help them practice more?
That is quite the call to action for everyone listening today, and for us on this panel with you. I'm going to do the most unfair thing I possibly could do because we are running low on time, and I do want to get to some of the audience questions and ask each of you a question that could be the topic of a full hour out of any of us. But let's just go through this one round robin style. I'm sure that everyone who's listened is wondering what they can do to move the needle here. So I'm going to ask each one of you for like a short answer, like a minute long answer.
Okay.
How can each of us address anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism in coalition building? I'm going to throw it over to you, Chava.
Of course, make me go first. I think one of the things that for me is a really critical piece of this going forward is to own your own discomfort in this conversation, and there's a level of defensiveness in this conversation. And when you are confronted with that feeling of defensiveness because someone pushes back, there's a recommendation made that maybe you feel is unnecessary or don't understand, that you sit with that discomfort and then you allow that initiative, that conversation to continue. Because I think so much stops both on on an institutional level because we hit a period of discomfort and can't move past it. And so in whatever space that we are, position of power that we hold, whether it be a synagogue or a Hebrew school or an institutional position, when recommendations are being made, when concerns are being articulated, to remove yourself and decenter yourself, and allow yourself to hear that critique and consider moving forward.
I'm just going to go across my screen. So, Eric, over to you next.
Yeah, I'm just going to echo that. Stay at the table. Look, don't let a privilege drive you from the table. I've sat at very hard tables. Like imagine, right? If I said I won't participate in any grouping where I'm going to experience anti-Black racism, right? How many Jewish institutions would I have not have spoken at because the way that security engaged, like with unconscious bias, right? How many labor tables would I have walked away from? How many other tables would I have left the conversation? We have to be in conversation, and what I'll say really quickly is the way we do that is we recognize, right? Not everyone who stumbles in racism or anti-Semitism, right, is intentional. They're not. We can't treat everyone like they're David Duke or Louis Farrakhan. When it comes to bigotry, what we have to do is to understand we all have to practice, and practice is hard. Practice is painful, right? We build the containers, but we have to stay at the table. We can't stay at the table with one another, right? The democracy is over. There are folks who are willing to tear it apart and tear it down. So stay at the table. Be frustrated, but stay at the table.
Yolanda, you've got the last word on this one.
Oh boy, I will just echo what Hava and Eric said, and add a couple of additional points to it, which is one, that we gotta build deeper roots. We gotta continue to work on building the relationships with one another so we can have these conversations. And if those roots are shallow, that's what's really kind of pushing us away. Because if the roots are shallow, the tree falls over, it's done. We're not communicating. We're back to our kind of silos, working independently on the thing that we need to be working together on collectively. So I say, getting proximate, really building and nurturing those roots so they can go deep. So when we need to have these courageous, candid conversations, we can have it. And then we can pivot to the next month and the next month and the next month and come back to the table, as Eric said. Stay at that table and work on this, because if we don't, I think our democracy is at stake, and we have to figure out how to do that. I think the second thing I would say is that this is a journey. There's no end point, and we say, okay, we're done, we check our box and we go home. We have to understand that when we start this work, we're committed. We're in it for the long haul, and we can't think about right now and how this will impact me. We have to think generations ahead and really think about how this is going to impact our descendants and their descendants to make this world a better place. And when we shift that mindset from the present to the future, or what we do right now is going to really set the foundation for that. I think that will hopefully help us, and is a call to action for us to really dig deep and be in community together and be prepared for some barriers and bumpy roads ahead, but to still stay on that journey together.
Thank you. And I wish we had so much more time to keep diving in. But what I would love to do now is turn to some of the really fantastic questions that have been coming in from the audience throughout the panel. And I'm going to start with this one because it's a big one. Since we're talking a lot about coalition building across sort of social justice community lines, can you address anti-Zionism in progressive social justice spaces that many say applies too simplistically a US-focused racial binary paradigm to Israel-Palestine, or a white colonialist settler white supremacy paradigm to that really intractable conflict? Anyone want to take a stab?
Yeah. I don't know if I can solve that in 1 minute. But I will say this, right? That we recognize here in the U.S. that the conversation around Israel, Palestine, right, is a third rail, meaning, right, it's a charged conversation. And in that charge, what we know, right, is that when people are more likely, right, to engage in acts of bigotry and bias, right, when they are under stress, right? And so it's not surprising that we then see both anti-Semitism and anti-Arab racism play out in these conversations. But look, there is nothing that makes that acceptable. Look, I try to tell folks, folks want to know, why does it charge me so much? And because I came up in the Pacific Northwest at a time of intense racial violence, where, quite frankly, most of the left and human rights movement ignored it. Right? They didn't see it as serious, and that's how we got to the moment we are in now. The left and human rights folks and racial justice folks don't want to admit that. Right? But we failed in this, and we tried to tell people. And those groups, right, they primarily used a lot of anti-Semitic code words like the Zionist occupational government, right, and other forms of ways of using Zionism, right, to utilize anti-Semitism. It was seen as a politer form of anti-Semitism. So I am always suspect when I hear it. Look, there is no ideology or worldview that is beyond critique. But what I'm saying is that in those critiques, there are forms of bias that are anti-Semitic. And I don't see how that serves to help solve the conditions that people are facing. And so I would just say this: if you're serious about critiquing Zionism, get it together on anti-Semitism then, right? And I'll say that in the same way. When folks come to talk about crime and social conditions in the Black community, right, you better understand racism, right? And if you don't understand racism, right, you're going to say something racist. I guarantee it. And I will be offended, and I'm going to respond. And the conversation will no longer be whatever that topic is about. It's going to be about your racism. And we understand that when we're talking about anti-Black racism, and we should understand that when we stumble into anti-Semitism as well. It's not as complicated. People say it's complicated. It's not complicated. Don't engage in anti-Semitic tropes. And if you don't know what they are, learn them. Right? We're supposed to be responsible leaders here.
I agree,
Yolanda,
and I
you
will
look
just
like
add. Am I
no,
on
go
mute?
ahead,
Oh,
Yolanda.
okay. And I would add that language is powerful. Understanding what things mean and the definitions of things is very important. And I hear people talking about Zionism, and the question I have for them is, do you completely understand what it is? And understanding how all of the things that impact the work that we do is not always this focus on Zionism. Is that anti-Semitic? What are anti-Semitic tropes? How is that impacting how you're thinking about Zionism? And we don't ever really have that conversation. It just kind of is painted with this big broad stroke in a lot of instances. And so there has to be opportunities to unpack those things and really get to the root of where some of the misinformation or misinterpretation is coming from. Is it conscious or unconscious?
Yeah, and I would add to that I think it's really important for social justice organizations to be educating themselves around anti-Semitism. I think it is something that in our conversations around learning about different abilities or racism, et cetera, gender identity, all of that we've kind of understood and internalized as these are important things for us who are working in this area to be learning about and to be educated on. And we have not made that same effort with regard to anti-Semitism because of the way it's perceived and because of the way the condition of Jews are seen in America. And we have to readjust our thinking because you can't have a conversation around Zionism if you are not educated on anti-Semitism, because it is way too easy and way too often that people lean into anti-Semitic tropes or language, partially because they don't know and they haven't made it a priority to know. And at this point and at this stage of the game, I think it's unacceptable. And we have to demand that people do better and people make it a priority if they are going to hold themselves out as a social justice movement or a social justice organization, that they have done that education.
I think that's just absolutely bang on. And Yolanda, you brought up the theme of words meaning what they people not knowing what words actually mean when they go to critique them. And we got a question. I want to just throw this over just to Eric to answer briefly because I know I've read some of your thinking on this. Is speaking of words that people don't necessarily know what they mean. How does the controversy about critical race theory tie into institutional and systemic racism?
Yeah, I mean, there has been this whole conversation around whether we can teach and talk and discuss accurate history, right? And look, this debate, this attack on critical race theory, starts with the rise of Holocaust denial and historical revisionism in the 70s and 80s. We recognized it then, right? We understood, right, that this wasn't an attempt to bring historic understanding to the Holocaust and the genocide of European Jews and what led up to it and the roles that people played and the long-term impact of it. It was an attempt to deny the Holocaust, right? And why? Because the impact of the Holocaust forever prevents the moral revival of fascism, right? And those who seek to spread authoritarianism and organized bigotry understood that. So they had to weaken it, right? And first they tried to attack it directly, right? To deny that the Holocaust occurred, that there was this intentional genocide, right? That it wasn't just a byproduct of World War II, it was one of the goals of Nazi Europe. And People tried to deny it outright, and then they realized they couldn't quite get away with that. So they began to dabble in historical revisionism, or what I call historical negationism, right? To first say that, try to argue it wasn't intentional, or to try to argue that it wasn't any more significant than any other form of bigotry. And here we are now in 2021, right? And we have seen the impact of allowing folks to get away with that. Now we have folks who are utilizing the same tactics and tools, right, to prevent people from talking about the impact of slavery in the United States, the impact of Jim Crow, the impact of Native genocide, right? That somehow talking about where we've come from, right, is going to weaken who we are and how we move forward together. Look, it is a way of stirring up fear. This idea that there's a right again that there's some conspiracy at work, right, to control people. And it wasn't surprising, Tima, to see in the earliest days of this rise of on critical race theory, which most people don't know what it is, right? But you saw it, right? The first accusations was critical race theory was developed at the Frankfurt School, right? And all the names they started listing were Jewish names, right? Folks who fled Germany and came here with some secret plot to brainwash our kids. Look, I'm old enough to remember, right, the Satan conspiracies, folks worried about rock and roll in high school, right? I remember, right? But no one seems to care that kids are gunning each other down with the same concern, or that kids are committing suicide or overdosing, right? Or not, getting any food before they go to school. But somehow, right, we've been manipulated into this false debate. And quite frankly, I've been asked, right, to be on panels, and I refuse to be on panels, just as I would refuse to be on a panel with a Holocaust denial, right? I am not here, right, to talk about whether slavery has had an impact on our society and on my life, right? That is a false debate. If we want to talk about the details and get into the nitty gritty so we can learn what happened, that's one conversation. But this is not the conversation around critical race theory, and it didn't surprise me a month ago to then see a principal say, we must teach both sides of the Holocaust, right? The different viewpoints. And that's how ludicrous this has become. And shame on those who got bought into that conspiracy. It's not your fault, right? But you have to know, right, that we are being manipulated. There are way more concerning problems in our society than that right now. And it's a distraction, and it's sad. It's performative, and it doesn't better schools. And I'll just say this because now I've gone on long enough, but don't we think students and teachers have a hard enough time each day going to school? And now we're bringing we're bringing our culture wars, our anxieties, right? And bringing them on those campuses and putting those teachers and students like in even more danger by whipping up all this hysteria. Like, really shame on us for this.
I am so sorry to have to cut off the conversation here, but unfortunately, we're already a little bit over time. And this has just been I mean, we've kind of come full circle to where we began this conversation, which is, Eric, you laying out some of the theoretical framework for how these fights are so deeply, deeply, deeply linked. And I think just to sort of really paint that one last time before I go into closing comments here. You're right. I also pointed to this very early on in the attack on critical race theory, that it was no accident that the Jewish Marxists were behind this in the minds of the people pushing this theory. It was very clearly what I started calling an intellectualized version of the Great Replacement theory. It
Mm.
was, taking it to the academic level, the faux academic level. And I think that's really important to keep in mind as we see this, is who's getting blamed for it. And you see it all over the conversation here. So if this isn't another clarion call for Jews to be active in the fight against anti-Black racism, I don't know what is. So With that, I'd like to thank all of you for a very engaging and thoughtful conversation. And it's so clear to me every day, and especially today, hearing all of you, that the fight against anti Semitism must include the fight against anti Black racism for the reasons you've outlined today and so many more. ADL, of course, takes this fight very seriously, whether by supporting the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and various police reform proposals, including the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, calling out racism in the media, including recently calling for the termination of Tucker Carlson, or playing a leading role in the Stop Hate for Profit campaign, along with partners like the NAACP, LULAC, Color of Change, and Sleeping Giants, or just helping people find ways to discuss hate at home with table talk guides on topics like systemic racism, criminal justice, bias, and more. And today it is my great pleasure to announce a brand new initiative at ADL, the Collaborative for Change, which is launching with a fellowship focused specifically on expanding awareness and understanding of how anti-Semitism and other forms of hate impact Jews with multiple marginalized identities. This year's fellowship is focused on understanding how anti-Semitism and racism overlap and intersect in ways that are uniquely harmful to Jews of color. We are inviting applications from people who are hoping to be fellows for a wide range of activities, multimedia projects, educational materials, academic research, and much more. And fellows are actually able to apply for up to $25,000 to cover this work. The applications are open now and are accepted until December 1st, after which point they're going to be reviewed by ADL staff and a panel of external advisor, all leaders in the Jews of color community. You can find out much more at adl.org/collaborative-for-change or by scrolling down on your screen. We hope that you'll join us for much more of the Never Is Now conference. I know I've got my conference schedule really plugged in here. And before you go, be sure to click on the full agenda button at the top of this page to see the full slate of panels from subject matter experts around the country. You can also scroll down to find ways that you can take action in the fight against anti-Semitism and hate. And finally, please add your voice to the conversation on social media and tell us why you're fighting anti-Semitism and hate using the hashtag #NeverIsNow. Now, for the next few minutes, have a stretch, refill your coffee or water, and join us at 3 p.m. Eastern Time for the next panel, The Story the Numbers Tell or Don't About Hate Crimes. Thank you so much for being here today. It's been my honor to have this conversation with our panelists and with you at home today.